Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, and many thanks to Congressman Pittenger for inviting me back to come and speak at this forum. It's much better to be here with you in this format than when I used to have to testify before him in the House Financial Services Committee. Less combative, more collaborative. I've chosen today to speak about the maritime domain since it's a topic that we rarely talk about in this forum, but it actually dovetails quite well with the Congressman's previous remarks. All my remarks are my own. They do not represent the U.S. government, the Pentagon, or the National Defense University. And for those who are interested, I'll have this presentation available for to share with the rest. So as we've seen during the course of today, we've talked about what we call the contested commons, right? The global commons. And obviously in my presentation today, I'm going to focus on the maritime domain, except we have to really see how interactive and, more importantly, how interconnected all these domains are, especially when we're talking about great power competition between the US, China, and Russia. And as you know, there's a lot focused now on cyberspace and actual physical space. But the original space was actually the maritime domain with things like the law of the sea. So as maybe most of you know, about 80% of global trade moves by sea. That actually is quite a huge amount when we take a look at it. And during the course of the pandemic, it became the lifeblood of global trade as land routes and borders were closed, as well as air cargo was actually paralyzed. So we've actually seen how different illicit actors have become much more resilient and much more reliant on maritime routes in order to move people and products and promote their nefarious agendas, whether they be criminal groups, traffickers, or in some cases, terrorist groups. So when we think about the global illicit economy, it takes place in every one of the countries represented at the forum today. But more importantly, we're now starting to recognize global illicit trade and transnational organized crime as a national security threat. Why is that? Transnational organized crime threatens the four basic elements and missions of any government. And you as legislators know this. The first is to provide security. The second is to promote prosperity. The third is to establish a society based on rule of law. And lastly, governance. What we're starting to see in different parts of the world is really the negative and actually corrosive and corrupting influence of different transnational criminal organizations that are financing actual candidates or corrupting sitting officials. And this is something that's very disturbing in the area that I cover, which is Latin America and the Caribbean. How are these groups being financed? And as you probably all know, this year and next year, there are going to be a very large series of countries in Latin America that will hold their presidential elections. And there's this big call for transparency in campaign financing. When we take a look and think about all these illicit activities, whether it's trafficking of drugs, guns, people, counterfeits, illegal mining, for example, these are not new phenomena. What's happened over the past 30 years due to globalization is that the velocity, the magnitude, the wealth, and for some reason in Latin America and the Caribbean, the high levels of violence per 100,000 in terms of homicides has really started to overtake and overwhelm different governments in the region. And what's happened during COVID is because of the interruptions in global supply chains, you've actually seen initially the groups being impacted, unable to move from point A to point B. But they become very adaptive, and they've actually incorporated a lot of cyber instruments in order to move what we call the cyber-physical domain, whether it's drug trafficking or human trafficking, trying to advertise, recruit, and actually sell and market their services and goods now online. As a complement to the traditional physical activities in terms of criminal networks. And what we've seen most pronounced has been the globalization of drug trafficking. Most of the cocaine now being produced in South America is actually destined for the shores of Europe and Asia. as the United States consumes less cocaine and heroin, which are plant-based. These are just a couple of the sites that I've selected where the largest actual operations of counter drugs have taken place, from Dubai to Russia to Belgium to Senegal, Nigeria, Australia, and Hong Kong. This is where we see the tentacles of global traffickers really take advantage of these maritime routes. Because as you all know, cocaine and other drugs don't have an expiration date like milk or butter. So they can actually spend many months moving around until they can find a vulnerable port in which to offload their product. And you're seeing very interesting collaborations between, for example, the Mexican cartels and the traditional Italian mafia in terms of moving. And sadly, too, it's so lucrative that it's worth the risk for these groups to start to create these alliances that we have not seen probably until the last 10 years. What's happening in the US, for those who don't live here, sadly in the United States we have an opioid epidemic where we've actually registered a record number of 100,000 overdose deaths in the last year. The taste of the American drug consumer is switching to synthetic drugs like fentanyl and methamphetamine. So what you're seeing is these groups are trying to adapt and move and adjust depending on the destination market. And sadly, these synthetic drugs also use maritime routes. For those who are not familiar, fentanyl has got the potency 50 times the power of heroin, and it's also being transported from China via maritime routes, mostly through Mexico, with the destination country as the US and Canada. We have spoken earlier today of a fantastic panel on human trafficking, where we talk about these migration routes. We focus a lot on what I call the land routes, right? These are the same routes that move drugs, weapons, guns, and money, but they're moving people, and people are actually the commodity. But we have to also remember that a lot of these container ships and small fast boats are being used to move the same migrants. Most of them are economic migrants, but there are also those who are rightly seeking political asylum. What we're seeing is large volumes. When they do maritime boardings and maritime operations, not only do they find drugs, but lately they've been finding migrants. Just to give you an idea, a migrant coming from Asia, from China, to come to the United States is paying as much as $40,000 to be smuggled into the United States. Therefore, we see, as the Congressman mentioned, how lucrative this business is, and sadly, there's many people who are so desperate that will pay these exorbitant amounts of money to coyotes in order to move them by land and by sea northbound towards the United States. And we can't ignore drug trafficking, human trafficking. All of them exist because of these groups' ability to use violence or the threat of violence through the possession and movement of large quantities of weapons and ammunition. So global arms trafficking is also conducted by sea. When we take a look at other kind of players, as we talk about external actors in Latin America, the Caribbean, and the Americas, you've probably seen a lot of coverage in the press about illegal fishing, particularly by large Chinese trawlers in the seas of the Caribbean as well as South America. And you're actually seeing how, first, how lucrative this business is and how damaging it is actually environmentally and to the economies whose territorial waters these operations are being realized. And then, as my dear friend Mario Federici mentioned about Maduro's Venezuela, we have to be worried about external actors in the Americas, particularly this movement of Iranian vessels into Venezuela that are providing all types of chemicals, gasoline, arms, and people in that very interesting Venezuela-Iran axis that is very troubling, that we've seen more recently, and a much more robust relationship as Maduro finds himself much more isolated diplomatically and economically, and yet he really relies on his sea assets in order to move, particularly that cocaine that's going to Europe. A lot of it's actually passing through Venezuela and also being flown out of Venezuela into many of the Central American countries that are actually represented here today. So what are we looking at? This strategic the competition between the US and Russia and China, it's not new. What's new is that different groups are starting to take advantage of emerging technologies and new battlefields, right? So we think about land, air, sea as the traditional ones, but now cyber and space itself as this area. And this is where, in terms of the US and its partner allies, we have to become much more creative and keep up with this innovation that we see being projected and capitalized on by our adversaries. So what do we have to do to think about how to combat this convergence of transnational threats, specifically in the maritime domain? We have to really expand our ability to use our intelligence agencies and security forces at sea. We still tend to be very siloed in all of our countries in terms of who's in charge of what. But we all know that collaboration actually creates better results and a better understanding of these different adversaries and different threats. We also have to improve the way we understand how these groups are adapting to what I call the COVID and the post-COVID environment. And this is where us understanding how they're adapting, why they're adapting, and who their new target markets are, and how they're recruiting people is very important. And to this end, we have to incorporate financial intelligence, our cyber capabilities, and new emerging technologies, and try to apply that into the maritime domain and maritime operations. And lastly, we need to promote more interagency and more international cooperation. So the forum today is a great example of how we can exchange ideas, best practices, and try to collaborate in order to better fight the fight against this network of illicit actors. And just to finish up, I just had the privilege of traveling to Colombia, representing the United States, for the first summit of the Naval Campaign Orion, which is comprised of 40 different countries focused on counter-narcotics in the Caribbean and in the Pacific. And it was a great display of how we put international cooperation into practice. And I hope this is just the first of many summits where we're going to try to improve the way we combat illicit activities such as narcotics trafficking on the maritime domain. And with that, thank you very much. You have my Twitter handle there if you want to follow up. But thanks so much for your time.